The house still smelled like flowers and grief, a suffocating mix of white lilies and fading incense that clung to the walls as if refusing to let go, just like I couldn't let go of him, my son, my only child, gone at 22, and every corner of the house whispered his name while every silence screamed it louder, louder than the condolences, louder than the prayers, louder than the hollow words people kept repeating as if they could fill the emptiness he left behind, but nothing could. Nothing ever would, and I hadn't slept, not for a minute, because every time I closed my eyes I saw his face, the way it looked the last time I saw him, still and cold. A face that once carried laughter now frozen into something unrecognizable, and they said it was an accident, a tragic accident at the airport, a fall, a misstep, a moment of bad luck, that's what they said. What everyone kept saying, as if repeating it enough times would make it true, but deep inside, somewhere beneath the crushing weight of grief, something twisted and sharp kept whispering that it wasn't right, that it didn't make sense, because a mother knows, a mother always knows when something is wrong with her child. Even when the whole world insists otherwise, and that feeling wouldn't leave me, it clawed at me, restless, relentless, until the morning after the funeral when the silence of the house was suddenly broken by the shrill ring of my phone, cutting through the air like a blade, and I stared at it. For a long moment, watching the screen light up with an unknown number, my chest tightening as if even answering it would require more strength than I had left, because I didn't want to talk to anyone. Not to relatives with their rehearsed sympathy, not to neighbors with their pitying looks, not to anyone who would say his name like it was just another word instead of the center of my universe. But something about that call felt different, heavier, like it carried something I couldn't ignore. And before I could stop myself, my trembling fingers reached for the phone and I answered, my voice barely a whisper as I said hello, and for a moment there was only silence on the other end. A pause that stretched just long enough to make my heart beat faster, and then a hesitant voice spoke, soft and unsure, introducing himself as Farhan from the airport's lost and found department. And the word airport hit me like a physical blow, my grip tightening around the phone as memories rushed back. The last place my son had been, the place where everything ended, or at least that's what they told me, and I forced myself to respond, my throat dry as I asked what this was about. And the man hesitated again before telling me that my son had left a bag there, a bag with my name written on it, and for a second I thought I had misheard him because it didn't make sense, none of it made sense. My son hadn't mentioned any bag, hadn't said anything unusual before he left, hadn't given me any reason to believe something like this existed, and yet the way the man spoke, careful and almost afraid, made it impossible to dismiss, and I shook my head even though he couldn't see me, whispering that it wasn't possible. That there must be some mistake, but he insisted gently that there wasn't, that he had personally received the bag from my son just 2 days before the accident. And my heart began to pound harder with every word he said, each one chipping away at the fragile wall of denial I had built around myself. And then he said something that made everything inside me freeze, something that echoed in my mind long after the words left his mouth. He said that my son had told him if anything happens to me make sure my mother gets this bag, and suddenly I couldn't breathe, my chest tightening as if the air had been sucked out of the room. My mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask, because asking them would mean accepting the possibility that this wasn't just an accident, that my son had known something, feared something, anticipated something, and I forced the words out, my voice shaking as I asked him what he meant, what my son had said exactly. But the man only replied that he couldn't explain over the phone, that it was important I come to the airport and see it myself, and the call ended shortly after, leaving me alone in the same silent house but with something new pressing down on me, something heavier than grief, heavier than sorrow, something that felt like the beginning of a truth I wasn't ready to face, and I stood there for a long time staring at the blank screen of my phone, my reflection faintly visible, a stranger looking back at me with hollow eyes and trembling hands. And for the first time since I buried my son, my tears stopped, not because the pain was gone but because something else had taken its place, something colder, sharper, something that cut through the numbness and forced me to think, to question, to remember every detail I had ignored, every moment that now seemed suspicious, every word he had said in the days before he died, and slowly, almost unwillingly, a realization began to form, fragile but undeniable, that maybe my son's death wasn't just a tragedy, maybe it was something more, something deliberate, something hidden beneath the surface of what everyone else was willing to accept, and as that thought settled into my mind, refusing to leave, I knew one thing with absolute certainty, I couldn't stay here. pretending everything was over, because it wasn't over, not anymore, not after that call, and whatever waited for me at the airport, whatever truth my son had left behind in that bag with my name on it. I had to face it, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much it changed everything I thought I knew, because if there was even the slightest chance that my son had been trying to tell me something, then I owed it to him, to his memory, to the love that still filled every broken part of me. To listen. The airport felt colder than I remembered, not just in temperature but in a way that settled deep into my bones, as if the building itself carried secrets it refused to speak aloud. And every step I took echoed too loudly against the polished floors, drawing my attention to the place where my son had last been alive, where his final moments had been reduced to a single word everyone kept repeating. Accident, but nothing about this place felt accidental now, not after that call, not after what I had been told. And as I walked through the terminal, surrounded by strangers rushing past with their lives intact, their laughter and conversations blending into a distant hum, I felt completely detached. Like I was moving through a different reality where everything looked normal but nothing truly was. And then I saw him, a young man standing near a small office tucked away from the crowd, his posture tense, his eyes scanning until they landed on me, and he stepped forward quickly, almost nervously, introducing himself as Farhan, his voice softer than I expected, like he was afraid of saying too much or too little, and I didn't waste time with formalities. I simply told him I needed to see the bag, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, because somewhere between the grief and the questions, something inside me had begun to harden, and he nodded, gesturing for me to follow him into the small office, the door closing behind us with a quiet click that felt louder than it should have, sealing us into a space where whatever truth waited inside that bag would finally reveal itself. And he walked over to a locker, unlocking it carefully before pulling out a simple black duffel bag. Nothing remarkable about it except for the small tag attached to the zipper, and the moment I saw my name written on it in my son's handwriting, my breath caught in my throat, my fingers trembling as I reached out. Because there was no denying it now, no room left for doubt, this was real. He had left this for me, deliberately, intentionally, as if he knew he wouldn't be there to give it to me himself, and the weight of that realization pressed down on me as I held the bag, its fabric cold against my skin, heavier than it should have been, not because of what was inside but because of what it meant. And Farhan spoke again, breaking the silence as he explained that he hadn't opened it, that he didn't feel it was his place, but that my son had come here 2 days before the incident, looking anxious, constantly glancing over his shoulder like he was being watched, and every word he said tightened the knot in my chest, because this wasn't the behavior of someone carefree or unaware. This was fear, clear and undeniable, and I asked him if my son had said anything else, anything at all that might explain why he left the bag, and Farhan hesitated, his eyes lowering for a moment before he spoke again, his voice quieter this time, almost reluctant, as if he wished he didn't have to repeat the words. But he told me that my son had said if anything happens to me they will call it an accident, and the room seemed to spin for a second as those words sank in, echoing in my mind over and over until they drowned out everything else, until the truth I had been trying to avoid stood right in front of me, impossible to ignore, and with shaking hands I slowly unzipped the bag, the sound louder than it should have been in the quiet room, like the opening of something final, something irreversible, and inside I found 3 items placed carefully as if they had been arranged with purpose, a notebook, a USB drive, and a photograph, and I reached for the photograph first, my fingers brushing against its surface before lifting it up, and the moment I looked at it, my heart dropped, because it was my son standing beside a man I knew all too well, a man who had been part of our lives for years, who had stood beside us through our worst moments, who had offered support when my husband died, who had been present at the funeral just yesterday, his face full of what I thought was grief but now seemed like something else entirely, my brother-in-law Kamal. And the sight of them together, standing side by side in what looked like a private setting, sent a wave of confusion and dread through me, because my son had never mentioned meeting him recently, never hinted at any connection beyond the obvious, and yet here they were, captured in a moment that felt too deliberate to be casual, and my grip tightened around the photo as questions flooded my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Why hadn't he told me? What had they been doing together? What had my son discovered that led him to leave this bag behind? And I set the photograph down slowly, my hands moving almost automatically toward the notebook, opening it to reveal pages filled with my son's handwriting, neat but urgent, lines of notes that stretched across the paper with dates, Names, numbers, and markings that didn't make sense at first glance but carried a sense of importance that was impossible to ignore, and as I flipped through the pages, my eyes caught the same name appearing again and again. Kamal, written in different contexts, underlined, circled, emphasized in ways that made it clear he wasn't just a passing mention but the center of whatever my son had been investigating. And my pulse quickened as the pieces began to shift in my mind, forming a picture I didn't want to see but couldn't deny. And finally my gaze fell on the small USB drive resting at the bottom of the bag, its presence quiet but heavy with implication. Because whatever answers the notebook hinted at, whatever truth the photograph suggested, I knew that this device held the real evidence, the proof my son had risked everything to gather, and as I picked it up, feeling its weight in my palm, I realized that this bag wasn't just something he had left behind, it was a message, a warning, a final attempt to reach me from beyond the moment that had taken him away, and the grief that had consumed me since his death began to shift once more, transforming into something sharper, something more focused. Because now I understood that this wasn't the end of his story, it was the beginning of something much bigger, something hidden beneath the surface of the life we thought we knew, and whatever truth lay inside this bag, whatever danger had forced my son to prepare for the possibility of his own death, I knew I couldn't turn away from it. Not now, not after everything, because this was no longer just about loss, it was about answers, about truth, and about a promise I hadn't realized I had already made the moment I decided to come here, that I would uncover whatever he had been trying to show me, no matter how painful it might be, no matter where it might lead. The notebook felt heavier with every page I turned, as if each line of my son's handwriting carried a piece of the truth he had died trying to protect, and my eyes moved quickly across the words, trying to make sense of the scattered details that were slowly forming a terrifying pattern, dates linked to transactions, names connected by arrows, short notes written in the margins like warnings he didn't have time to explain fully, and again the same name appeared, Kamal, underlined, circled, written with a pressure that almost tore through the paper, and my chest tightened as I realized this wasn't coincidence or misunderstanding, this was deliberate, this was investigation. My son had been tracking him, documenting something far bigger than I could have imagined, and I forced myself to keep reading despite the way my hands trembled, because stopping now would mean turning away from the truth he had trusted me to see, and slowly the pieces began to align in a way that made my stomach drop, references to shipments that didn't match official records, large amounts of money moving through accounts that shouldn't exist. Coded notes that hinted at illegal deals hidden behind the facade of the family business, the same business my late husband had built with trust and honesty before his death, the same business Kamal had taken over, promising to protect our future, and the betrayal of that promise hit me like a physical blow, because this wasn't just corruption, it was deception woven into the very foundation of our lives, and my son had uncovered it, quietly, carefully, without telling me, perhaps to protect me or perhaps because he knew how dangerous it was. And as that thought settled in, a cold realization followed close behind. He hadn't just discovered something illegal, he had discovered something worth killing for. And my gaze shifted back to the USB drive in my hand, its significance now undeniable, because whatever was written in this notebook was only the surface, the real truth, the undeniable proof, had to be inside that small device, and I looked up at Farhan, who had been watching me with concern, as if he could see the storm building behind my eyes, and I asked him if there was a computer I could use, my voice steadier than I felt, and he nodded quickly, guiding me to a desk in the corner of the office where an old computer sat, its screen flickering to life as he turned it on, and for a brief moment I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the USB drive, because I knew that once I saw what was inside, there would be no going back, no pretending this was all a misunderstanding, no escaping the truth that was waiting for me. But then I thought of my son, of the way he had looked in the final moments I saw him, and the hesitation disappeared, replaced by a quiet determination that surprised even me, and I inserted the drive, my breath catching as the files appeared on the screen, folders labeled with dates and short descriptions, each one a piece of the puzzle he had been putting together, and I opened the first file, a video recording that began with a shaky frame before focusing on a dimly lit room, voices in the background becoming clearer as the seconds passed, and then I heard it, a voice I recognized instantly, calm, controlled, and unmistakable, Kamal, speaking about shipments and payments in a tone that carried no trace of the kindness he had shown us, discussing illegal operations as if they were routine, as if they were nothing more than business, and my heart pounded in my ears as I listened, the reality of what I was hearing crashing over me in waves, and I opened another file, then another, each one revealing more, audio recordings of conversations, documents detailing transactions, evidence that painted a picture of a man who had built his power on lies and crime while standing beside us pretending to be family, pretending to care, and my hands clenched into fists as anger began to replace the numbness, because this wasn't just betrayal, it was destruction. He hadn't just risked our lives, he had taken my son's life to protect his secrets, and then I found the final video. Its file name simple but chilling, and for a moment I couldn't bring myself to click on it, because something inside me already knew what it would contain, and when I finally did, the screen flickered before revealing my son's face, looking directly into the camera, his expression serious but calm, as if he had already accepted what might happen, and my breath caught as I leaned closer, every part of me focused on him, memorizing every detail as if it might be the last time I would ever see him alive. And he spoke softly, his voice steady in a way that broke my heart, telling me that if I was watching this, something had happened to him, apologizing in a way that made tears blur my vision even though I tried to hold them back, explaining that he had discovered something he couldn't ignore. Something that needed to be exposed no matter the cost, and then he said the words that shattered whatever remained of my doubt, that Kamal was involved in something dangerous, something illegal, and that he believed his life was in danger because of it, and as the video continued, he told me he had gathered enough evidence to prove everything, that the USB drive contained what I needed to bring the truth to light, and that if anything happened to him, I shouldn't stay silent, I shouldn't be afraid, because the truth mattered more than anything else. And when the screen went black, the silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced before, because there was no uncertainty left. No questions without answers, only a single undeniable truth that burned through me with a clarity that was both painful and empowering. My son hadn't died in an accident, he had been silenced. And for a moment the grief threatened to overwhelm me again, rising up like a wave ready to pull me under, but it didn't, because something stronger pushed back against it, something fierce and unyielding that I hadn't felt before, and as I sat there staring at the dark screen, my reflection faintly visible once more, I realized that the person looking back at me was no longer the same woman who had walked into this airport, broken and lost, because now I carried something else alongside the pain, something that steadied my hands and sharpened my thoughts, purpose, clear and undeniable, and I whispered his name under my breath, not as a cry of sorrow but as a promise, because I understood now what he had been trying to do, what he had sacrificed himself for, and I knew I couldn't let it end here. I couldn't let his story be reduced to a lie, to a single word that erased everything he had fought for, and as I finally looked away from the screen and met Farhan's concerned gaze, I felt the last trace of hesitation disappear, replaced completely by a quiet, controlled resolve, because this was no longer just about grief or loss, it was about justice, about finishing what my son had started, and making sure that the truth he had died for would finally be heard. The funeral had ended, but the story they wanted to close with it had not, and as I stepped back into my house that evening the silence no longer felt empty but charged, like the calm before something inevitable. Something that had already begun the moment I opened that bag, and I moved through the room slowly, my fingers brushing against familiar objects that now seemed like remnants of a life that no longer existed, a life where I believed in the people around me, where trust came easily, and betrayal was something that happened in stories, not in my own home, but that illusion had been shattered, replaced by a truth so sharp it cut through every memory I had. And yet instead of breaking me it had done something else, something I hadn't expected. It had steadied me, hardened me, turned my grief into something focused and unrelenting. And I knew exactly what I had to do next. There was no confusion, no hesitation, only a clear path that stretched out before me, and it began with a simple phone call, my hand steady as I dialed Kamal's number, listening to the ring echo in my ear, each second stretching longer than the last until he finally answered, his voice familiar, calm, almost comforting in a way that now made my skin crawl, asking if I was all right, if I needed anything, playing his role perfectly as if nothing had changed, as if he hadn't taken my son's life to protect his secrets, and I forced myself to match his tone, to keep my voice even, telling him that I had found something that belonged to my son and that I needed to speak with him in person, and there was a brief pause on the other end, a crack so small most people wouldn't notice it, but I did. because now I was listening differently, hearing what lay beneath the words, and then he agreed, saying he would come over right away, and when the call ended I didn't move for a moment. I simply stood there holding the phone, letting the reality of what I was about to do settle over me, because this was it, the moment everything would change, not just for me but for him as well, and I walked to the table where I had placed the USB drive earlier, picking it up and turning it over in my hand, feeling its weight, knowing that it carried the truth he had tried so hard to bury, and without wasting another second I had already done what needed to be done. I had sent copies of every file, every recording, every piece of evidence to the authorities, ensuring that no matter what happened next the truth could not be silenced again, and by the time Kamal arrived the plan was already in motion, the outcome already set, even if he didn't know it yet, and when he walked through the door he looked the same as always, composed, confident, his expression carefully arranged into one of concern and sympathy, stepping toward me as if he were still the man I once trusted, the man who had stood beside me at my husband's funeral, who had promised to take care of us, and for a brief moment I wondered how someone could wear such a convincing mask for so long, how he could look me in the eyes and pretend nothing was wrong, but then I remembered the recordings, the words I had heard in his own voice, and whatever doubt remained disappeared completely, and we sat across from each other, the distance between us filled with everything that had gone unspoken until now, and he began to speak again, telling me how strong I had been, how proud my son would be of me, his words smooth and practiced, but they no longer held any meaning, they were empty, hollow, and I let him finish before I responded, my voice quiet but firm as I agreed with him, telling him that my son would indeed be proud. And then I reached forward and placed the USB drive on the table between us, watching as his eyes dropped to it, as recognition flickered across his face before he could hide it, and in that moment the mask slipped, revealing the truth he had been so careful to conceal, and the silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, filled with the weight of everything we both knew, and I leaned forward slightly, my gaze locked onto his as I spoke the words I had been holding back, telling him that I knew everything, that I had seen the files, heard the recordings, understood exactly what he had done, and for the first time since I had known him he looked unsure, his composure cracking as he tried to speak, to explain, to justify what couldn't be justified, saying that I didn't understand, that things were more complicated than they seemed, but I cut him off before he could continue, because there was nothing he could say that would change the truth, nothing that could bring my son back. And I told him that I understood perfectly, that I knew he had killed my son, and the words hung in the air between us, final and undeniable, and for a moment he didn't deny it, didn't argue. He simply looked at me with a mixture of fear and something else, something close to desperation, and then he admitted it in the only way someone like him could, not with remorse but with justification, saying he had no choice, that my son had discovered too much, that he had become a threat. And hearing those words didn't break me the way I might have expected, instead they confirmed what I already knew, solidifying my resolve, and I straightened in my seat, my voice calm as I told him that he had chosen the wrong answer, and before he could react the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, footsteps following as the police entered, their presence immediate and undeniable, and I watched as realization dawned on his face, as the confidence he had carried for so long finally crumbled, replaced by fear, real fear, the kind he had made my son feel in his final days, and as they moved toward him, placing him under arrest, he turned to look at me one last time, his expression searching for something, perhaps mercy, perhaps understanding, but he found neither, because I had none left to give, and as they led him away the house fell silent once more, but this time the silence felt different, no longer heavy with unanswered questions but steady, grounded in the truth that had finally been brought to light. And later that night as I sat alone in my son's room, surrounded by the memories that still lingered in every corner, I allowed myself to feel everything I had held back, the grief, the anger, the love that refused to fade, and I whispered softly into the quiet, telling him that I had done what he asked, that I hadn't stayed silent, that I had finished what he started, and for the first time since his death the pain didn't feel like it would consume me entirely, because alongside it there was something else, something that gave it meaning, justice, not the kind that erases loss, but the kind that ensures it was not in vain, and as I closed my eyes I could almost feel his presence, not gone but carried within me, a part of me that would never disappear. And I knew that while my life would never be the same, while the emptiness he left behind would never truly fade, I had honored him in the only way that mattered, by making sure the truth was heard, and by refusing to let his story end in silence.